Hello. Alistair Campbell, when Tony Blair's chief spokesman, once said, "We don't do religion." And this week, as Parliament prepares to vote on the assisted dying bill, one of Blair's friends and ministers, Lord Falconer, seemed to agree that religion should not do politics. The headline in Tuesday's Times read, "Labour rift as Peer says keep religion out of assisted dying debate," as if matters of life and death were off-limits for religion. When working for the BBC, I met attitudes similar to those of Campbell and Falconer. Television Centre thought that religion should be kept to ceremonials and Sundays. Unfortunately, this is not easy when an Archbishop of Canterbury resigns over the cover-up of abuse. It is now almost 3 weeks since the Makin report was published, which led to Justin Welby's downfall. But it is likely there will be more resignations to come, and certain that there will be more abuse cases in the offing. How well equipped are broadcasters to deal with these issues and the theology involved? The man who has done more than anyone to expose the abuse of John Smythe QC, the man at the centre of the Makin report, is the writer and broadcaster Andrew Graystone, who inspired the first Channel 4 report on John Smythe in 2017, and who, in 2021, published Bleeding for Jesus, a book which laid out Smythe's crimes and their devastating consequences for the abused in forensic detail. Andrew Graystone, welcome to the podcast. Before we start talking about the issues surrounding abuse in the church, I wanted to ask you a question about the attitude of many people towards religion and whether it has a place in public life. And I'm stimulated to ask that by our Times headline on Tuesday morning, which says, "Labour rift, as Peer says, keep religion out of assisted dying debate." This was a reference to the Justice Secretary saying that her Muslim faith obviously made her take up certain attitudes towards dying. I'm fascinated by this idea. Keep religion out of the assisted dying debate. Can you?
I mean, it's impossible, because questions around life and death and ethics and rights and wrongs are the heart of religion, and they're universal. Nobody is going to make a decision about assisted dying or about anything else that isn't in some way religious. Now, I suppose what people may mean is keep institutional religion out of the debate. Don't listen more to religious leaders than you would to other kinds of experts. But assisted dying, like so many other things, is a religious question. It's a human, spiritual, moral question. It's unavoidable. At its best, the religious traditions have deep wisdom and long wisdom that they can bring to this. Of course, at its worst, institutional religion says you must vote this way or that way, or behave this way or that way. But there's nobody who faces their death without asking deep spiritual questions. So how do you keep it out of the debate? It's a nonsense.
I just thought I'd come across that sort of argument or that attitude frequently in my career in broadcasting and journalism, and I wonder if you had this assumption when you're in the BBC or Channel 4 or elsewhere that somehow religion is slightly peculiar, done on Sundays and usually by people wearing funny hats. The idea that it's integral to people's life and tries to address key issues or the most important issues seems to certain people in journalism still somewhat strange. Have you felt that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's what's done for religion as a specialism in broadcasting in the BBC and elsewhere. The feeling that religion was somehow attached to some kind of privilege, which of course it has been in, politically speaking, in all sorts of ways. But that one of the things we must do is kind of expunge religion from as much of society as possible. And I think that's partly what's done for religious broadcasting as a specialist genre in the BBC and elsewhere. It's in a lamentable state now, which we may go on to talk about.
Well, I would like to yet a little bit later, but if we could return to the subject that you've been preoccupied with for many years, and which has resulted in the downfall of an archbishop. And in your latest blog, you said there are 10 more bishops, if you like, who knew about the cover-up in the case of John Smythe and have not yet gone, or maybe never will go. Can you perhaps take us back to the beginning of all this? Because there was a report in the Sunday Times, I think, about 2 weeks ago, suggested that this source that took Channel 4, the details of what was going on, as if this was rather a secret. Actually, you were the source. You had the...
I'm prepared to out
yourself.
As
you
that
were the source. Indeed, you've written a book about it, so it's hardly the secret. But anyway, so in 2017, how did you come by all of this detail about the abuse committed by John Smythe, a barrister who worked within a specifically conservative evangelical church tradition?
Well, after a time spent working in TV and radio production and specialising in religion, I was freelancing, and one of the things that people used to use me for was to give comms advice, particularly in religious organisations and charities and so on. And I was called and asked by this organisation called the Titus Trust if I would give them some advice, because they had received a disclosure of non-recent abuse, and they were a bit worried that it might hit the newspapers and damage their reputation. So I was called in to see them, and they handed me a bundle of documents that I then took away about this man called John Smythe. And I went and did my homework, my due diligence, my research on that. And the more I looked, the more I realised that this was much bigger and much more serious than, well, either than they had told me or than they knew. It turns out that actually they knew much more than they had wanted to tell either me or the police. So I went back to them and said, look, this is very serious business, much bigger than you've said. You need to get someone in from the outside to look it over from top to bottom, and then you need to take what's necessary to the police or to the social services. And then after that, I will help you to explain to the world what it is that you have found and what you've done about it. And their response was, well, there's no way we're going to do that. Off you trot.
That puts you in a difficult moral position, does it? Because you're now aware of the colossal scale of abuse and the cover-up involved. The organisation, the Titus Trust, which was a successor in a way to the UN Trust, which was very much involved in this business, they've employed you. Did you have any moral qualms about taking the information they'd given you and then publicising it?
A bit. Yeah, I thought it through quite carefully. But I don't think that you owe a duty of confidentiality to an organisation that is covering up criminality. What you should do, of course, is take it to the police. But they had taken some of the information to the police, who didn't seem very interested, partly because it was 30 years ago and it appeared on the surface that it may have been consensual, and the perpetrator was in South Africa. So the police weren't very interested, and I realised that the police weren't going to get interested until there was a much bigger case to answer. And by myself, I wasn't in a position to do all that work. So I thought carefully over a number of weeks about what to do about it, and eventually decided to talk with Kathy Newman at Channel 4, who I had done a little bit of work with before.
And what's astonishing to me is that, obviously, as a result of the Channel 4, the interviews and the report that they did in 2017, the Church of England set up the Making Review. You went on in 2021 to publish a book, Bleeding for Jesus, an exceptional book in my view, which details so much, so that it's very difficult to understand why in 2024, 3 years after your book, 7 years after the Channel 4 interview, the Church of England could in any way be surprised about what it reveals. I mean, you laid it out. You must have been baffled, weren't you?
I do. There's a kind of... it's intriguing that people like the Archbishop of York, for instance, have said, oh, I was deeply shocked when I read the Making Review. And I thought, really? You could have read the book a couple of years ago. You could have watched Channel 4 7 years ago. You wouldn't have been quite so shocked. Perhaps the shocking thing is that actually this has come out into the public even more widely. And I am surprised at how it's taken off, actually. I've been in touch with many of John Smythe's victims on a daily basis for a long time. And we had agreed that we thought that when the Making report, which was, of course, it was took over 5 years. It was a 9-month report that took over 5 years to produce. But we'd always said, when it comes out, there'll be 48 hours of attention, and then the caravan will move on. Well, here we are, nearly 3 weeks, I think, after the report came out. We've lost an archbishop, and there is still intense press interest in aspects of this story, as I think there should be.
Well, I think it's fundamentally. I mean, I belong to a church on the parish council and so on, and you will be aware of the anger, the grassroots level in the church at this. I mean, here is the church is supposed to stand to and for the good and for honesty, and at a local level, immense strides have been made in terms of protection. We're all checked on a parish council, everything else. I mean, it's been astonishing. So at grassroots level, there's been immense steps forward and a real care and concern and involvement in abuse, whether it is within the church or outside. And then they look at the hierarchy and what's going on, delay, the refusal to have an independent outside body investigating abuse, the dissembling, shall we say, and I hesitate to say lying, but shall we say being economical with the truth. And there's frankly a real sense of disgust at parish level.
There is, and one of the things I think has emerged is that there are effectively two Church of Englands. There's the Church of England that operates at parish level, that runs the food bank and looks after the elderly and provides opportunities for worship and community. There's that. And as you say, that's really substantially tackled the safeguarding question. In terms of preventative safeguarding, the Church of England is about as good as a big and complicated organisation could be. But then there's the other Church of England, which is the Church of England of power and privilege, and at the level of the bishops and the senior church civil servants, as it were. And what is emerging there is an awful culture of bullying and dissembling and power broking that really has nothing to do with the local parish church, and probably some would say nothing much to do with Jesus of Nazareth either.
You see, I was struck by the fact that when you were writing your book published in 2021, the period running up to it, you contacted Lambeth Palace. I mean, it wasn't as if you went aside and, wrote this up and then delivered the book and said, here, have a look at it. You actually tried to get Justin Welby to talk to you. You did get one of his representatives in Lambeth Palace to talk to you, although it seemed from your account all they wanted to know is what you knew, not what had happened and therefore what they should do about it.
In all my contacts with Lambeth Palace and with Justin Welby, the impression I got was that they wanted to know, how much trouble are we in? How much do you know? What's coming towards us? That there wasn't a sense of wanting to know about the story in itself. And that was summed up for me in the interaction that I had with Lambeth Palace overseeing the book in advance. They were extremely keen to see the text of the book in advance. Now, I've been around the block enough to know that that's probably not a terribly clever idea. So we weren't wanting to show them the book until a publication was a fait accompli. Nevertheless, in discussions with the publisher, we decided to do a deal with Lambeth Palace. And the deal was that we would show them the text of the book shortly before publication, and that in exchange, the Archbishop of Canterbury would write a foreword. Now, had he written a foreword to the book, I think it might have had more attention 3 years ago, which in the end might have been a good thing for him. So we did this deal, but we said to him, hang on a minute, if we show you the book and you really don't like it, what will you do then? And they agreed that they would write, at the very least, a kind of commendation. They might write something we could put on the cover that said, this is a terrible story, we're deeply upset by it, but it's important that it's been told, or something like that. So on that basis, we agreed to show them the text of the book a few weeks before publication. There was then a long pause, and I kept having to go back to them and saying, could we have the text of this forward? And I kept getting emails saying, yes, it's on its way, we're reading the book. What I eventually got at the last minute was a message saying, there's no way we're going to write a forward for this book. There's no way we're going to commend it. We think it's libelous. So, in brackets, go ahead and publish if you wish, but we think it's libelous. So I dare you. And I got a long 6 or 7 pages of notes from the Archbishop personally, and also annotations from his chief of staff, saying all the things that they disagreed with in the book or that they thought were factually inaccurate. And there were a couple of things, actually, that were quite helpful for fact checks. But they had quite a strange attitude to the truth. Let me give you a couple of examples. They're trivial examples, but there's one point in the book where I mentioned that when he was at Cambridge, the Archbishop Justin Welby was involved in the rowing scene at Cambridge, along with his best man, Charlie Arbuthnot, and that it was notable that when the other rowers went out drinking, Welby and Arbuthnot, who were known to be keen evangelical Christians, would only drink water. Now, Justin Welby wrote in his notes to me, "That's not true." Well, I heard that from sources who were there, who had been there, who had described that to me. So what did Justin Welby mean when he said it's not true? It felt as though he was saying, well, I don't wish that to have been true, or I don't want people to know it was true. As another example, there's one point where I mentioned that he was losing sleep as Archbishop over the emerging safeguarding stories. And he wrote in his note, "How could you possibly know that?" Well, I knew that because he'd said it in an interview. But it was as if they'd lost control of the narrative and they couldn't cope with the fact that people knew some stuff that they didn't want known.
Well, leaping forward from 7 years from that point of view, when your book's written, the Macon Review is delivered to Lambeth Palace, quite a bit ahead of publication. It's transparently obvious to anybody who reads it that he has to go, and he's got an option. Because there's not that, to be honest, having read your book, the Macon Review has some interesting extra detail, but nothing substantial that I can see.
No, I think that's fair.
Nothing substantial, the detail, but nothing substantial. So they've got this. And what's astonishing to me is that the opportunity is there for the Archbishop to say, we've got this report, it's truly shocking. I think I should accept responsibility on behalf of the Church and resign. I will then devote my time to ensuring that, as far as possible, that the Church investigates the rest of this thoroughly. I will put this into play, I will do this, whatever, but it's right I should stand down. At which point, great sympathy to Justin Welby. He was a good man in many ways and done lots of things. They got it transparently wrong. Within 2 or 3 days, of course, they have to go into reverse, and the man is, in a sense, or he thinks, presumably, and others around him, is hounded out of office. They've lost control of the narrative. Just from a professional point of view, that's astonishing, isn't it?
The Church is paranoid about managing the narrative, managing the media narrative and the public narrative, and spends huge amounts of money on it, millions of pounds every year, but it's absolutely hopeless at doing it. I can remember a conversation a long time back with Mark Thompson when he was Director General of the BBC, and he was forever getting into public trouble, as you do if you're Director General of the BBC. And he said to me, what you have to do is you have to stick your ice axe in the rock and hang on tight. And you have to answer every journalist's question that is put to you until the journalists run out of breath. And that's the opposite of what the Church of England has done in terms of media management. They've done it. They did it with Rowan Williams, and they did it again with Justin Welby, which is you make your quick statement and then you disappear under cover and say nothing else. Now, in those days after the Macon report had come out, had I been advising the Archbishop of Canterbury, I would have said, get out and explain yourself. Go and talk to every journalist that's passing in the street. Go and talk to the Morning Star and Blue Peter and explain what has happened and use this as an opportunity to speak about your theology. What better opportunity he had to speak about the theology of sin than the revelations around John Smythe. But in fact, what they did was he went on to Channel 4 News. He said, I'm not resigning, there's nothing to see here. And then he disappeared. And the next thing we heard was an announcement saying he was resigning. Well, it's just really poor media management, but I think it comes out of a sense that the media and the religious establishments are at war with each other for control of the public narrative, that there's a battle between the two. And I regret that battle, and I've worked against that battle throughout my career, really. It seems to me that journalists and religious figures have a great deal in common. If you want to know what's going on in your local village, the people who are most likely to know about it are the vicar and the editor of the local newspaper. And the thing that the journalist and the religious professional have in common is that we, in principle, we are seekers after truth, and we are exposers of hypocrisy. We're on the same team. And we've somehow got ourselves into a state where religious professionals feel like the media is the opposition. It's not. It's not unless you ask it to be.
And just before we leave this particular part of the interview, I mean, you said that there are 10 more bishops who, there are 10 bishops who knew about this and are still, they haven't resigned.
Yeah.
We know that, and I can't talk about it, but there's a case coming to the courts next year of further abuse. There is lots more to come. I mean, this will not go away. The abuse historically are more recent than the John Smythe. But moving back to John Smythe.
Can I just to fill that in a little bit? Since I've been involved in this, kind of reluctantly involved in this whole area of religion and abuse, people come to me every week of every year with new disclosures of abuse in the church. And 99 times out of 100, they say the church has mishandled this allegation of abuse, and that is causing me extra harm. I know that there are at least 3 major church abuse stories affecting the Anglican Church that will break in 2025. Now, Lambeth Palace knows that as well. The Church of England knows that as well. Why do they want to wait for everything to be dragged out of them rather than putting it on the table?
Because they still haven't introduced, as Professor Alexis Jay wants them to do, and as far as I know, the whole church, everybody I know wants them to do, is to introduce an independent, totally independent organisation to look at abuse within the church. They still weren't there. Now, there's complicated reasons we should go into, but that's still the case. Now, until that happens, at the very least, this will continue. But can we go back now to the nature, the specific nature of John Smythe? Just to summarise very quickly, and you correct me if I get it wrong. He's a barrister. He got involved in camps called set up by the Ewan Trust, set up by a man called Reverend Eric Nash. And the intention of those camps was to, as it were, ensure that conservative Christian evangelicals were in the hierarchy and moved into the hierarchy of the Church of England. And it did so by identifying what it thought were people at Winchester, for example, public school, or in Oxbridge, young men who they thought were likely to be or have a good chance of going into the hierarchy. So that was what the aim of it all was, and and they were very successful. They had an Archbishop of Canterbury, of course, who did that, and they had people involved with the Alpha Course and so on. The camps at which they were organised, there's no suggestion that those camps more generally were involved in abuse. It's specifically John Smythe, and his form of abuse was the most extraordinary beatings, which we perhaps shouldn't go into the detail, but extraordinary, which his wife knew about, and which necessitated, and I'm sorry to give the detail, adult nappies being used, because in some instances the people who were beaten up so that they bled. So it was horrific.
It's important to say that they were clearly criminal acts.
They were clearly criminal acts. But you've said, and let me quote you here, the least discussed but arguably most important chapter of my book, Bleeding for Jesus, is the appendix. In it, I cover the origins of the Ewan Titus discipleship movement, its theology, its theological and historic roots. Why are they so important? Because something which on the whole in the coverage gets missed, which is the theology, which is maybe distorted theology, which is underlining the camps and which John Smythe was able to exploit.
Yeah, theology is a word that gets in the way sometimes because it's a slightly scary word, but it's really all about why people do what they do. What it is that people believe that results in the actions they take. And there are obviously fundamental beliefs behind this movement, ultra-conservative evangelicalism, that led to or provided the context in which John Smythe thought that his abuse was appropriate. And those roots need analysing, because that hasn't gone away. hasn't gone away at all. There are still many people within that movement who share those theological, sociological beliefs. And although their behaviours aren't necessarily the same as John Smythe, they're producing the same results, even up to this day.
It's the association in many ways of sex with evil. I mean, it doesn't start from the point of view of sex as a gift for God and then how we need to deal with that, because it has profound consequences in our relationships and so on. But it tends to the view of very specifically homosexuality is evil, sex outside marriage is evil, and so on. And it also then, and this is what Smythe was obviously play upon, when you've got young men who are, as they would say, committing self-abuse, others would say masturbation and so on, as they're in the late teenage years, whatever, it in a way plays upon their guilt and says certainly that is wrong. Now, what John Smythe then did was essentially to say it's not just wrong, it's evil, and for this you must be punished, and for these sins you must be punished. And he was able to use quotations from the Old Testament, which apparently would authorize, as it were, what he did. So it's not just that there was the culture of, if you like, some would say a very conservative attitude to sexuality. It was also the assumption that you needed to be punished for your sexual desires. That rings a chord with me, with my own limited evangelical upbringing when I was a kid. It wasn't off stream like this, and I wasn't at boarding school and everything like that. But I recognize all of that. So it's central to understanding the culture, isn't it?
There's a confluence of streams of thinking about sexuality, the human body, that kind of hatred of the human body, and that the human body is to be suppressed. It's your enemy. And that comes together with a strand that says that violence is redemptive, that the violent death of Jesus on the cross deals with, in some way, with your sinful life. And there's a strand about God as being a father who's a better father than any father that we could have in our ordinary family experience. And those things get woven together, and at each step there's a misstep. Smythe would say, God is your father, but God can't be here, so I'll be your father instead. Well, that's clearly a theological misstep, I suppose. There's the idea that Jesus suffered to deal with our sins, so it's a short step from there to say that we need to suffer in order to deal with our sins. There's a belief that the human body lets you down a lot, and therefore it's your enemy and needs to be suppressed, which is a kind of a further misstep. So if you put together all those kind of slightly quirky missteps of belief, you get to a situation where it seems sensible for one older man to beat younger men to rid them of their sins. And it is really important to understand this, not just as a kind of corrupt practice, but as a set of beliefs. And they're the same beliefs that lead to this kind of privilege and English exceptionalism on which those camps were built. And there's racism, there's eugenics, it's all about what people believe, which takes us back in a way to what we were saying earlier, which is the thing, we have to understand the things that we believe, that human beings believe, in order to understand the ways that human beings behave.
Yeah, and I would go down the line, but you can see the growth of Christian nationalism in the United States, which is picking up some of these things very much, which is a special selected white group of Christians who, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, superior race, yeah.
One of the things that's not been picked up is the kind of racist element of that whole movement. Now, I think it poses problems to the church, because the church, if it looks at itself hard enough, will see a lot of things that it doesn't like, and therefore better to not look.
Just going back to the abused, and one thing, people have had the good fortune never to be abused or whatever, sometimes think perhaps two things. One is, why haven't they got over it? And two, why, in a sense, do they feel so guilty about it? And what I suppose we're looking at when you're looking at Smythe in that religious context is that the sense of guilt, that in some way the individual is persuaded or can't get away from the idea that they have deserved this, or they have been complicit in some way. So it's not just that, they have the reaction you might expect, oh, well, it's John Smythe, he was a thug, wasn't he, whatever. It is much more confusing than that, and much more difficult to get away with it. And I was struck talking to some of your people of the abused who, at the age in the mid-60s, and in every sense are, mature people capable of dealing with a whole raft of situations. When this subject comes up, they almost inevitably, at some point, are in tears. It just doesn't go away. Why? Am I right about why that sense of, in some way, I was responsible, which is a ridiculous notion, but that lingers with people?
Yes, it does linger. The nature of abuse is that it marks the body and the personhood of the individual. It's one person trying to impose themselves and their personhood on another. And if you do that, particularly to a child or a teenager or a young adult, then it leaves a kind of deep wound that doesn't really heal. You can deal with it. We all have to look back on our childhoods and our adolescence and our early lives, and we look back at the things that we like about it and the things that we don't like about it, and we find ways of becoming our own person out of it. The nature of abuse is to mark the person with the personhood of another, to override an individual's autonomy. And the shame of allowing someone to do that doesn't go away. And the echoes of, well, I wonder whether that is true, whether what that man was saying about me or demonstrating about me, I wonder if there was some truth in that. It doesn't go away. Some people manage better than others. Victims of abuse deal with it in different ways. Some deal with it through counselling. Some people draw a line in their lives and say, right, that was before then, and now I'm going to get on and I'm going to build my life on a different sort of foundation. Some people deal with it by, in a sense, putting it in a box and sitting on it and never looking at what's happened. And that's the most dangerous of all, I think. If you, for instance, just to bring it back to this situation, if you remain in the same culture that produced that abuse and you try and tell yourself, well, it was just one bad apple or one bad day, but you haven't had that kind of self-examination that allows you to get perspective on it and to realize how wrong it was, that's very dangerous. And there are people in the church who were, for instance, victims of Smythe and have simply not reflected on that, dealt with it in themselves in a way that's given them distance from it. And those are very dangerous people still in the church.
And the extraordinary thing about Smythe is that, well, there were so many extraordinary things. How can I say there one extraordinary thing? But the fact is that he seems never have to reflected on what he's done in any real sense. When he left the UK, he went to Zimbabwe, where he continued to set up the circumstances that would allow abuse to continue. He then moves to South Africa. At no point in his life is it possible to see him acknowledging to himself, let alone other people, the nature of his abuse. And his family was involved, and of course we've had the interview with his son that conducted by Channel 4 News, where it's taken his son, only really since Smythe's death has it been possible for his son, a pastor, an evangelical pastor, to begin to examine this in any real detail. That is the extraordinary thing about Smythe. Have you any suggestion that he understood himself?
Not at all. There's a classic moment of telly which has been repeated a lot over the last few weeks, where Kathy Newman doorsteps Smythe outside a flat in Bristol and confronts him with it. And he says, I'm not talking about that. Why are you asking about that? What are you doing here? And there's no sense of kind of reflection. This has finally caught up with me. I've been agonizing over this. In my work for my book, I went to Cape Town and tried repeatedly to meet with him. Went to his house, put notes through the letterbox, tried to phone, sat in a cafe with an invitation for him to come and meet me. There was no sense in which he wanted to reflect on this, even at the end of his life.
And even towards the end of his life, when his son got cancer, he told his son that the son had cancer because it was God's punishing him. I mean, that's just unbearable.
That's
just unbearable.
Deeply shocking.
Finally, and I'm sorry to bring this to a close, but we know there are a significant number of bishops who have, as it were, on this particular issue, not come out. Dreadful phrase. We know, and you've told us there are future scandals to come. And you've also said that the church and, in a way, journalism don't properly understand each other. Well, what can the journalists do so that they can more properly understand this? The great danger, if you don't understand it, seems to me, is to think all these people are a little bit peculiar. I'm not peculiar, so it won't happen to me. So unless understanding is increased. Now, we talked about the BBC earlier, and you and I both perhaps believe that the BBC, for whatever reason, has reduced its ability to report in an intelligent and sympathetic and investigative way into religion and to explore, as it were, the religion experience. Why do you think that's happened, and did you see any sign of that changing?
I think it's deeply worrying that the BBC has chosen to withdraw its specialism of religion, that there's not the expertise anywhere in the BBC now to understand religion and religious institutions at a deep level. If there was as little understanding of science as there is, or of football as there is of religion, the BBC would not be doing its job well. But I mean, the BBC is not alone in this. There are, newspapers have tended to kind of sack or demote their religion specialist correspondents as well. There is this sense that it doesn't matter. And I wonder if it's the BBC sort of repenting of its previous rather patrician attitude in relation to religion. Back in the early days of the BBC, it saw itself as a kind of a church.
Well, I think so. I mean, when you look at John, I hate to say I first read the religious part on the BBC when I was 22, about over 50 years ago. And certainly it was great resentment in the corporation of, as it were, the hours that were set aside for religion. And of course, there was still the shadow of John Reith over it. John Reith said the BBC is Christian, and, the first Director General. So there was in the 60s, and I think in the early 70s, a sort of reaction against all of that. But subsequently, it's been alleged about the BBC that it's been out of touch with a lot of things, a lot of local, regional attitudes and so on. It's centralised in London. And I think in terms of religion, my experience is that it's consistently seen religion only in external senses. I've seen it both as in opposition to science, which it is not necessarily so, seen it in terms of religious services and large buildings, but not seen it as a perspective on the most important issues in life that we all face, and with accumulated wisdom, as you'd said earlier. And I'm not sure, and whenever the BBC has run reviews, whatever, they write fine words, but there's no action taken. I mean, no action taken. So we have a situation where in the next few months or a year or so, further abuse cases, and both sides will look, in a sense, incomprehendingly at each other. It's if we're thinking about that Matthew Arnold, those lines of Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach. Here we stand something on a darkling plain where ignorant armies clash by night. That might be the future. Yes,
I mean, the BBC now has a religion editor in its news department, Ali Maqbool, and very good he is too, but it's very limited in its resources. The BBC's commitment to religion has always traditionally come in three forms. BBC News have had a kind of investigative responsibility, and then there's been a current affairs wing that has a fine history of producing documentaries and all sorts of things. And then there's been a more confessional wing that produces worship services and so on. All three of those have been denuded, really, to the point where I'm forever getting calls from journalists at the BBC and elsewhere saying, could you explain what an archdeacon is? Or why is it that the Archbishop of Canterbury can't just tell people what to do? Or would it be safe if we use this bishop or that bishop on Thought for the Day or on whatever it is? And I just think, that's not my job. Surely the BBC needs to be a resource of understanding and wisdom about those things. But that's gone, and that's really worrying.
Well, I could perhaps declare myself something here, self-interest here, which is I'm a trustee of the Religion Media Centre, and if people do want to find out things about religion, go there because it's set up, I like the Science Media Centre, to do that precise thing, really, which is to try and make sure people are informed. It doesn't have it doesn't say religion is a good or bad thing. It just says here, in order to understand this central part of human existence, here's as much as we can. And how much as we can say. Look, Andrew, thank you very much for talking to us. I could have talked for so much longer, but I greatly appreciate. And now I suppose you have to go back to your job as being the unofficial reference point for journalism on religion. Well, good luck.
Well, one of many, I hope. But, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Roger.
My thanks to broadcaster and author Andrew Graystone. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do support us. It will cost you less than a cup of coffee a month. You can do this by either a one-off payment on our crowdfunding page or regularly by signing up to patreon.com/BeebWatch for £1.99 per month. By signing up to Patreon, this will also entitle you to my weekly blog, which gives my take on the week's interview. The link to this and to our crowdfunding page can be found in the description of this programme. And that's it for this week. As you probably know, this podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and it's produced by Kate Dixon. The sound is by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a Good Egg production. Until next time, goodbye.